I'm inclined to think that there are indeed quite a lot of alternatives to mere facts. Anyway, look, I've got fewer than 15 minutes to try to explain what the good Lord took 7 whole days to accomplish during the creation. So a little bit of ingenuity is required and a little bit of speed too. But one of my favorite observations about human behavior comes from the American racing driver Mario Andretti, who once said, if everything seems under control, you're simply not going fast enough. So anyway, a government official recently asked me how to encourage creativity in schools. And I said, I know exactly how to do it. Make it illegal, because that would really be a profound stimulus. But I actually don't like the word. I talk about creativity a lot, possibly too much. I actually don't like the word at all. It's been attenuated so far and stretched to the point of all meaninglessness. I mean, put it this way. I mean, I recently saw a shop which said creative dry cleaning. Anyway, so look, it's impossible to formulate or quantify. It's as futile to try and be factual about creativity as it is embracing fog. You just can't do it. There's no formula. There are no conventions. If creativity were something you could measure, it probably wouldn't be worth bothering about. I personally feel there's nothing less cool than data, and that facts, notwithstanding Bobby's comments, facts are really rather dismal. I've always been fascinated by that American mathematician Claude Shannon, who created information theory and also made that amazing conceptual distinction between signal and noise, which effectively made modern computing possible. And Shannon made a really important distinction between data and information. I mean, data is just a set of measurements. I mean, for instance, this lectern is 1.5 meters tall. That's a bit of data. It's actually not very interesting. But information is data, which has a sort of meaningful, interpretative, creative spin on it, saying this lectern is 1.5 meters tall, but it's almost certainly the most beautiful lectern I've ever seen as well. I mean, that's information. It's more interesting. But look, even despite my skepticism about facts, I'm not advocating sort of formless chaos in human behavior. On the contrary, I think rules tend to be an inspiration to genius. And I like what the poet Robert Frost once said about writing free verse is like playing tennis without a net. I mean, there's really no point in it. I think most of all that in our data-driven world, I think it's very important to advocate original thinking, the humane idea of original thinking. In the beginning, creativity was literally prehistoric. Here's a fabulous shot of Prometheus, a trickster stealing fire from the gods on Olympus. And this theft of fire allowed us to do all sorts of things independently. First, you could make bricks, then you could cast iron to make plowshares, then you could have flame-grilled Big Macs. But this fire, the fire, actually using fire for cooking is really interesting, because that actually it became an extraordinary way of efficient cooking, became a very efficient way of processing and handling energy. Then when we stopped the theft of fire, allowed us to cook, and that released in our body that released the stomach from a lot of its duties and allowed our brains to enlarge. But I'm interested. This is an idea of theft. That's why we've got fire and theft here. You've got to remember that the very first bit of original thinking, the very first bit of creativity, was actually an immoral act. It was stealing. I also think there's quite a lot to be said for bad manners. And here is a charming photograph of Bernie Ecclestone doing a fine impression of bad manners. And Bernie is, of course, the impresario of Formula One motor racing. I actually think Bernie was a sort of genius because he put Goethe's definition of genius was it's put the ability to put form on the indeterminate. And what Bernie did 30, 40 years ago, he looked at this international spectacle of motor racing and realized it wasn't a sport, but it was a potential medium. And that was an extraordinary thing. So there was genius there. But you've never, ever heard anybody say about Bernie, what a charming, sweet man. Bernie, I suspect, would agree with that wonderful French poet, Jean Leroy, who said, a bad reputation never did anybody any harm. Bernie might also agree that the meek tend not to inherit the fast lane. I mean, traffic is just modern traffic is just one example of how belligerence and bad behaviour can be rewarding. Actually, there's actually a very good case you can actually make if you want to be perverse, and I often enjoy being perverse. That there's a lot to be said if you want to succeed in business for cultivating wickedness. In fact, it's quite hard to prove that unblemished virtue is actually a valuable business asset. Bad people can do lots of things. As Thomas Mann once said of Hitler, it's actually futile not to recognize that Hitler's vile achievements were made possible by the exercise of great art, in presentational terms. And indeed, it's interesting. We know now that sociopaths and criminals and visionaries share similar characteristics. They've all got huge egos, but also have the ability to spot a system open to exploitation. Then we have the perversity of major advances in civilization. The mathematician A.N. Whitehead once said, the major advances in civilization are processes that all but wreck the society in which they occur. And sure enough, here is an early experiment with a nuclear weapon. J. Robert Oppenheimer, one of the people responsible, said, well, it worked. A few people laughed, a few people cried, most were silent when they saw this atrocious sight. And in the NBC documentary about Hiroshima, Oppenheimer later quoted from the Bhagavad Gita. He said, now I am become death, destroyer of worlds. I mean, my point just here is that something you observe about creativity is actually the urge to destroy is in itself a creative act. There's also quite a lot, I think, to be said for boredom. Here's a fabulous painting by Walter Sickert, sometimes reputed to have been Jack the Ripper, by the way, but Walter Sickert, it's in the Tate in London, and it's called ennui. Ennui is a version of boredom. The thing about boredom, as an aid to original thought, is boredom, and here's a paradoxical thing, boredom is actually terribly, terribly interesting. I mean, simply because boredom is not a Hades of futility and waste, or boredom, if you get bored, it actually inspires a search for purpose. I mean, boredom should inspire you to escape from the prison of the here and now. Boredom was what, for instance, inspired Henry Ford. He said, gazing at the enormous tedium of the Midwest, Henry Ford said, I had to create the gasoline buggy to escape from boredom of life on the farm. Maybe, if you're interested in cultivating original thought, creativity, call it what you will, we should find actual ways of cultivating boredom. Then there's the matter of connecting things, and here is Steve Jobs connecting something on a very, very early Apple computer. Jobs said that it's actually original thinking, creativity. It's about just making connections, he said, putting one thing together. But he was actually being disingenuous. He knew it was a lot more than that. Jobs was interested in Zen, and there's that wonderful Zen precept that talent is the ability to hit a target. I mean, Zen and the art of archery. Talent is the ability to hit a target, but genius is the ability to see a target which no one else can. But what's certain is, and in the pursuit of original thought, what's certain the more ideas and the more information you have, the more likely you are to be able to successfully to connect things. Another important characteristic which you need to cultivate along with boredom is the one of cussedness. Because what's certain is if you look at creative people, high achievers, original thinkers over the ages, they've always have an absolute disdain for convention. When asked what he would save if his house was burning down, the poet Jean Cocteau said, I'd save the fire. Einstein deliberately ignored axioms and came up with that wonderful line, if I knew what I was doing, you couldn't call it research. He actually identified the fact that he just simply didn't know what he was doing. He was literally exploring terra incognita. Einstein's father gave him, as a boy, gave him a compass as a birthday present. But young Einstein, didn't use the sort of flickering needle to find the way home. He actually used it to unlock the secrets of the universe. So there's an interesting connection for you. Vertigo, danger. I mean, danger is something to be cultivated by original thinkers too. Danger is, of course, extremely stimulating, as anybody who's stood on a railway track looking at an oncoming locomotive knows, or anybody who's stood on a parapet, or anybody who's been dangled off a Dubai skyscraper, as you can see here. It is this business of, particularly this vertigo idea, it's what French call l'appel du vide, the call of emptiness, what psychologists call high place phenomena. It's that peculiar thrill of danger you feel in tall buildings and at height. But you're actually, when you have that experience, the l'appel du vide, you actually are enhancing life by actually risking it. But what the larger point here is for creative people have to not just tolerate risks, but I think actively cultivate them. It was once said, you constantly must be looking for the edge, but you'll never find out where it is, because anybody who's found out where the edge is has already gone over it. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in, that wonderful little couplet by Leonard Cohen. Certainly, if you want to do original thinking, you've got to, like flirting with danger, you have to cultivate mistakes as well, because mistakes are not actually dismaying, but they're extremely stimulating. A mistake, I think, is simply an opportunity to start again more intelligently. As Miles Davis, the musician, said, if you're not making a mistake, you're making a mistake. But here's an example here. This is where the crack line comes from. This is in civil engineering, this is the infamous calamity of the Hyatt Hotel in Kansas City in 1981, when an ambitiously designed floorway collapsed, killing 141 people. An appalling disaster, of course. But this mistake actually caused the rewriting of the rules of civil engineering. Another thing original thinkers need to do is actually cultivate solitude, because original thinking rarely happens in crowds. Leave me alone, I often think, is a profound statement of creative intent, and necessary if you want to get stuff done. I mean, why? Because I think, again, historically, you can see that artists of real stature tend to work alone. For instance, in the 13th century, the poet Petrarch was the first person we know of who actually climbed a mountain for pleasure. Mozart found his ideas came to him when traveling alone in a carriage between Vienna and Prague, or during sleepless nights alone. And the companion to solitude is privacy, a precious modern invention. I mean, privacy didn't exist, for instance, in the Middle Ages when there was communal sleeping and communal eating. And something which worries me about the data-driven world, which I find so unsettling, is that privacy is under threat here and now. And I think it's really essential to find ways of cultivating privacy. Another thing which original thinkers see as creative people is they learn how to see, to penetrate rather than just to merely look. And Michelangelo is the perfect example of this. Michelangelo operated so far beyond conventional limits in every field he worked in: architecture, painting, sculpture, poetry. He was called by his contemporaries Il Divino, the divine one. And what Michelangelo did and how he explained it was, he said, when he looked at a block of stone, he didn't just see a block of stone and think, crikey, what on earth am I going to do with this? He actually had, this is one of his slaves, he actually had the perception that inside the block of stone there was a living person waiting to be released from it. And there's a metaphor here I'm trying to hint at. And what he was doing with his hammer and chisel, was just releasing the figure inherent in the stone. And in the same way, I think, the muses, the people who stimulate our creativity, the muses sort of occupy parts of our brains, our minds, which are not accessible to ordinary people. Michelangelo said, and I think this is just perfectly inspiring, the greatest danger is not that our aim is too high and we miss it, but it's too low and we reach it. Another thing people worried about original thinking and creativity fuss about is stage fright if you're an actor, or writer's block if you're a writer. Never, ever, ever trust anybody who complains about writer's block. Writer's block is just the sort of medicalization of vanity. It fascinates me that writer's block was only identified as a phenomenon in about 1947, which is exactly in America by an American psychologist, at exactly the same moment that the great American novel with a capital G-A-N was becoming a phenomenon in popular culture. And writer's block was just an affliction which affected people who found they couldn't write as effortlessly and well as Norman Mailer. But the creative endeavor here, but with writer's block or with any other sort of blockage which stops you doing things, is just actually do it. With writing, you actually learn to write by writing itself. Now, what you might call the booze muse, another thing, drink and drugs. Here's Manet's painting of the absinthe drinker. You have, it's true to say, here is a fact, one of my rare facts, by the way, you have to go a very, very long way to find a great artist, whether it's a musician, or a writer, a painter, or whatever, who was a teetotaler. I mean, there are almost no examples I can think of. Absinthe was, of course, terribly popular in the 19th century, hence the Manet painting we're saying here. I mean, absinthe, it produces severe convulsions, blackout, constrictions of the throat, and very likely death. I think these alone cannot explain its popularity. Drink and drugs, we know, may assist in the generation of ideas. Indeed, Hunter S. Thompson said, based on his own experience, he'd positively recommend substance abuse. But if drink and drugs can actually stimulate ideas, they're not very good at helping you, collect and analyze them, because you have to be awake to describe a dream. And Hemingway, as ever, had the best advice here. He said, write drunk, but edit sober. Here's Descartes, the critic of pure reason, who Descartes said, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. You can now actually reduce that. Is it true when we have machines to think for us? Still true when we have machines to think for us? The modern world puts this assumption of Descartes under scrutiny. But I think, as I said, the digital world to me is a terrible, terrible disappointment. And I'm not a Luddite or a technophobe at all. It's undermined independent thought in exchange for us being able to send a clip of a surfboarding hamster around the world instantaneously. And talking of the way our data-driven culture has compromised original thought, Google will now finish your emails for you. There's what's it called, Google Compose, whatever. I find that terrifying. As Neil Postman, the author of a wonderful book called Amusing Ourselves to Death, observed, people come to enjoy the technologies that undo their capacities to think. And that's actually a thought he stole from Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Lastly, I think real creative people don't acknowledge limits. What we're advocating here, we're advocating theft, bad manners, mistakes, danger, abusive behavior, social exclusion, all of these things. These are all, I think, contribute powerfully to original thinking. And that makes you wonder, doesn't it, whether it's actually, whether it's worth encouraging in the first place. I emphatically, think it is. And right now I'm wondering what next we have to steal from the gods. And if you think we've stolen everything already, I'm afraid that merely thinks you're probably not thinking creatively enough. Anyway, thank you.